Hello again. Good afternoon. This is Jason Gifford from Sustainable Energy Advantage. I have my colleague Jim Kennerly, also from SEA, joining for today's presentation. Thank you for joining the call and for your time. We have some attendees still filing in, but as it's a few minutes after the hour, we'd get started. In just a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony Starr at the IPA for an introduction, but just a few housekeeping items before we do that to answer some questions you may have. First of all, this session is being recorded, so it'll be available to you and for review and for you to share with others. Afterwards, we will provide the recording to the IPA, and I presume it'll be posted at the same location as the other materials that were posted in advance of this meeting. Speaking of which, you received by email a link to both presentations that you will see today. So you already have access to these. In fact, you have access to versions with a little more detail than we will have time to go through today. So please refer to those as you prepare written comments, which is the final thing I wanted to touch on. We look forward to your comments. They're due on March 28th, so a full 2 weeks from today's presentation. And this is somewhere in the midpoint of this process. So your comments are instrumental to the development of our final report on this subject. So we appreciate the time and effort that we hope you will put in to those and look forward to that phase of the conversation. Anthony, are there any introductory remarks you'd like to make before we get into the content today? Let's make sure that, Anthony, it looks like you can unmute yourself if hopefully you're hearing me. Okay, perhaps I should have confirmed at the outset that everyone can hear me. Maybe if you could enter a comment in the chat box, or Jim, if you're on and can hear me, can just give me okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, attendees, for that feedback. I really appreciate that. I apologize. It's not immediately apparent why Anthony can't unmute himself. An organizer. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Apologies, Anthony. I see. It says only that you're self-muted. All right. We will try to troubleshoot that. I don't have an immediate answer, so I apologize for that. But maybe then we can bring you back in once we're able to figure out how to unmute you. Transitioning to the content and the two feature PowerPoints of today's presentation, we are going to divide our time today approximately equally between two presentations and discussions. Each is going to have its own Q&A period, and we encourage you at that time or at any time during the presentation to begin submitting questions with the caveat that waiting to the end gives you the benefit of seeing all of the content that we're going to cover. Again, this is Jason Gifford. I'll present the material on the rec price policy design, and Jim Kennerly will present the IRA-related analysis. In both cases, the material that we're presenting reflects SEA's review as policy and market analysts. We are not attorneys and are not intending to provide a legal interpretation of the enabling statutes. We certainly understand many of the current interpretations and associated limitations, but nonetheless, and overall, what we are trying to do is offer ideas that we hope will result in a productive discussion and a set of recommendations for consideration. We do hope you've already had a time to review the posted PowerPoints. If you have not, we encourage you to do so while drafting your written comments, as we've included some additional background and detail there. But we'll present the highlights today, intending to leave lots of time for discussion. Okay, so the context in which we're having this conversation is, of course, that the IPA is exploring options for updating its rec pricing methodology. And hopefully you all are clear, but in any event, the adjustments, if any, would apply beginning with the 2024 to 2025 program year. And that's because the report that SEA will develop will be used by the agency to for consideration as part of the next long-term plan. So following that, the implementation would be in the 2024-2025 program year. Of course, pricing for the 2023-4 program year is occurring in parallel to this discussion. Okay, so diving into the adjustable block program and Illinois Solar for All rec pricing policy design issues, options, and implications. We want to first start with a discussion of a framework. And in other words, what are we trying to accomplish? So overall, the policy objective, of course, is to meet the RPS targets. But when you get to the individual programmatic level, it's important to describe and prioritize what the program design is trying to accomplish in each instance. It's common, of course, to have more than one thing that you're trying to accomplish, and equally common to have some tension between those objectives. For example, the easiest to illustrate this fact are cost effectiveness, or sometimes least cost, and rapid deployment, right? These we can envision how these are naturally somewhat in contrast with one another, and we'll get into more detail as we go. Other objectives may include technology diversity, installation size diversity, or project type diversity, and of course, each of these elements are at play in the Illinois programs. So through our practical experience across geographies and time, we've become, apologies, give me 1 second. So with our experience to date, market participants and policymakers have generally concluded that when you're on a track aimed mostly at cost effectiveness, we end up with policies that center around competitive procurement, where rapid deployment, in other words, more megawatts quickly, is the primary objective. This tends to favor obligations on retail entities and a market-based system, maybe with a price cap, but generally otherwise where rec prices are allowed to fluctuate based on supply and demand. In a situation in which policies have multiple priorities or a variety, or intended to serve a variety of market segments or otherwise multifaceted, this is where we tend to get more prescriptive designs intended to provide predictability for a number of different segments. And so the context we have here largely aligns with that third category. So in that context, we're going to go straight to some of our overall observations on the rec price setting process, and then recommendations. So the entirety of a cost-based approach to rec price policy is the concept of a representative project. So of course, this would not reflect the economics of any actual individual project, but when it's done correctly, it's intended to enable projects within a modeled cost range to be economical. So to do this, you need to accomplish a balance of scrutinizing individual inputs with arriving at an overall revenue requirement, and then ultimately rec incentive that enables the set of projects that you're targeting to participate in the market effectively during a specific period of time. So there are two important elements there. One is the sector or segment of targets you're trying to promote, and the other is the particular period of time in which you're willing to promote them, because market dynamics and costs change over time. And so the cost-based approach is intended to address that. It is not intended to produce an incentive that is high enough for any and all projects to be developed. And similarly, at the other end, if you focus on least cost for each individual input, it's unlikely to result in an incentive that supports robust development. So, in parallel, in the rate setting context, these are the issues that you all are currently working with. We do believe that the cost-based approach is well aligned to Illinois' policy objectives, and this means we believe it's appropriate to continue using a discounted cash flow analysis as the basis of the rec price setting process. So for example, the CREST model or something similar. And the benefit as compared to other more abbreviated ways of calculating a levelized cost of energy is that you can effectively include the nuance associated with tax incentives, with operating costs over time, with financing assumptions, and project performance. And you can do all of this in a transparent and auditable way, which in our experience in other states has demonstrated that it supports a robust dialogue around what the appropriate assumptions should be, and it builds a consensus around the incentives themselves. Nonetheless, there may be an opportunity for some well-timed and appropriately scaled adjustments. So this is the conversation that we hope to have with all of you. In informing our observations and recommendations, we are focused, of course, on the enabling legislation and associated regulatory framework. So we're focused on transparent annual schedule of prices, on those values being either set or the product of a formula, and allowed to adjust at a predictable rate over time. So this slide lays out our thought process on what the implications of those phrasings are, the types of policy designs in general that are likely accessible, and those that may not be accessible under the current legislative design. So I'm going to move into the specifics here so that we can talk with some specific examples in mind. Over the next few slides, going to talk both about elements of design. So for example, this first slide talks about the initial REC price setting process, and then the other dimension we'll talk on is near-term options, and then longer-term options. So on the subject of initial REC price setting and near-term options, as I've mentioned, we recommend retaining the current annual cost-based approach to the present value cost of energy calculation, but to consider whether there may be opportunities to modify the PV, the present value net metering credit calculation. For example, to forecast the individual rate components as a means of arriving at the present value net metering credit. There's a few reasons for this. One is that the rearview mirror isn't always the best indicator of the future, and particularly in an environment where there's more focus and expectation on electrification, there may be good reasons to, even though no forecast is perfect, to view the future a little differently than the past. Even aside from that, there are reasons why the individual components of a net metering credit should be considered differently. For example, the energy component and T&D components are just fundamentally different as you look at the rate at which those might change and the reasons why, looking out into the future. Even with a view on the net metering forecast or the shape of that going forward, there's the matter of considering the starting point, whether that's a multi-year average of historical net metering credits or the current, or using just simply the current period net metering credit, and there are pros and cons to each. In the longer term, the major topic we'd like to get on the table for discussion as it relates to the initial REC price setting is the potential to focus in more on the project's total revenue requirement. This is one of the components of the current calculation, but we wonder whether it may be advantageous both for developers, their investors, and ratepayers to focus in on the levelized cost of energy. Here I'm also referring to as a strike price, as a means of guaranteeing a total revenue, and then allowing the REC price to vary based on a simple formula, which is the difference between the strike price and the net metering credit as you choose to calculate and revise it over time. The benefit here is we are intending to support financing at the least possible cost, provide stability of revenue and therefore returns, which may result in a lower cost of capital. There are a couple potential variations here when you index a REC, so to speak. One, the more conservative approach is one in which there is a minimum REC price of 0. So, shorthand here is that the project would benefit from the upside if and when the net metering credit exceeds the strike price. The other option is to not have a price floor, in which case, when net metering credits are greater than the strike price, a credit would build that would reduce future REC payments when the net metering credit is once again potentially less than the strike price. Obviously, lots of details to talk through here, but trying to give you an appropriately scaled flyover during this presentation. So, with respect to REC contract duration, we're not immediately recommending a change, as these are set by legislation, but one could weigh the benefits of essentially 15 or 20-year commitments. On the 20-year side, when you better align the contract duration with project life, there's an opportunity for a lower overall cost of energy. Similarly, with respect to REC payment frequency and timing, this is likewise prescribed in the legislation, but in line with the strike price approach previously described, there may be some merit in thinking in the long term about migrating the all pricing, or I should more clearly, all pricing for categories greater than 25 kilowatts to a monthly as produced regime. Over the next couple of slides, we're going to introduce first a potential approach related to year-to-year pricing adjustments, and then after that, intra-year pricing adjustments. So first, on the year-to-year potential adjustments, this, to be clear, is what we're referring to as a post-processing adjustment. So there is still the annual cost-based CREST modeling process that would each year result in a cost of energy and then REC price calculation, but then in recognition of market-based and specifically not cost-based factors that may impact the market, we consider here the potential for an adjustment to the incentive after that annual cost-based process has been completed. And there are a couple of ways of doing that. So this first slide introduces changing the cost-based rate as a percentage of the project's calculated revenue requirement. So like the strike price, the revenue requirement is the overall cost of energy for the project. So in these series of examples here, we're exploring measuring how much of individual block capacity has been awarded at the end of a prior program year, and then adjusting the incentive as a percentage of the project's overall revenue requirement. Those adjustments would be upward until you have a year in which at least 75% of the block capacity is fulfilled. By comparison, in an instance where there is waitlisted capacity, a downward adjustment to the annual cost-based amount would apply. Option 2, or the variant here, is this: the structure is very much the same, but rather than adjusting the incentive as a percentage of the overall revenue requirement, this option would adjust it as a percent of the calculated REC price. So you just end up with a slightly more modest adjustment, but the overall conditions here are generally the same. One could come up with additional options for variance based on different levels of block capacity award, or different percentages of adjustment when those award levels are reached. With respect to potentially adjusting REC incentives within a program year, here again, we're looking at categories greater than 25 kilowatts. And the condition would be in an event of fairly significant, maybe I was going to say under subscription, but maybe use the word here, uptake. If the block has less than 25 or between 25 and 50% adoption at the midpoint of the applicable program year, then one may wish to consider a 10 or 5% adjustment respectively to the REC incentive within that year to encourage additional adoption. This mechanism has only a lever that would increase the price. It is assumed that once you set a REC incentive for a particular category, for a particular megawatt allocation, it's presumed that as a policy, you would be happy to fulfill the entire block at the price. This is simply intended to capture the situation in which there is not sufficient uptake in a particular category. Here too, you could vary the percentages that are measured and the amount of the adjustment, subject to statutory limits, of course. Well, in light of the amount of time I've taken so far, I don't want to repeat myself. These slides largely summarize the near and long-term objectives as I've laid them out so far. As I've said, maintaining the cost-based approach, resetting that benchmark annually, considering a change in the way that the net metering credit is forecast, particularly in its component parts, and then reviewing and considering the option for both inter and intra-year adjustments based on individual block uptake. In the longer term, we are hoping to encourage a discussion about the strike price. Again, that's the overall revenue requirement guarantee concept as a vehicle to potentially lower the cost of capital and LCOE, which would result in a lower overall REC incentive requirement. So for each year, in that instance, you would calculate the actual REC price incentive based on the difference between the strike price and the market value of production. As it relates to the Illinois Solar for All aspect of the program, much of the emphasis here is on eligibility and different types of blocks to incentivize, and less focused. And those items are incredibly important, but not the focus of the REC price setting process. So we have a little less in terms of specific quantifiable recommendations related to that category so far, but think it's important for the market to allow time for those segments to respond to the price signals that are currently there, and then making adder adjustments incrementally over time may be appropriate once there's a little more experience with category uptake. We wanted to recognize also the pilot program underway to address some of the non-price factors within these markets, and recommend reviewing the results of those programs before considering further adjustments to the REC adders and incentives in the Solar for All program. In the category just simply of other recommendations that relate also to the cost-based annual rate setting, and just more generally, we think it is appropriate to collect actual project cost and performance data as year over year as the program evolves. And what this allows you to do is consider some Illinois specific market conditions that just allow to a more informed incentive setting process tailored to the Illinois market. Okay, so now we'll see if we can pivot to to the discussion phase of this this first presentation. I'll use this also as an opportunity to remind you that we look forward to your written comments here, both on the specific questions that we've offered in the Word document that's posted on the IPA's website, as well as the initial recommendations in this presentation that we're discussing today. It is helpful to us if you're as specific as possible, providing actionable suggestions. And again, there's a 2-week period in which we'll be accepting and looking forward to those comments. So give me just one moment to review the questions panel.
Jason, you can also just unmute folks individually if you want to just ask them to raise their hands. So.
Yes, so I think, Jim, thank you. That's a great idea, and I just wanted to see if we had any questions to address right off the top.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll take the opportunity to remind everyone there was a question about finding where to find the initial PowerPoints, which has been answered in the chat board. Hopefully that was answered in a way that distributed to all of the attendees.
Yeah, when I answered it, I said to do it to all, but if folks can't see it, just let me know and I'll try it again.
Okay, great, and it's on the IPA's website, and we can probably share that page on the screen when we get to the end of this discussion, if that would be helpful. Well, great. So if there are questions, happy to take them either in writing or, again, as Jim said, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and allow you to ask it verbally. Okay, so thank you. We have a question that asks on the topic of project-specific data collection, why wouldn't market demand be a good enough proxy? Thanks for the question. I would certainly agree that market demand is a good proxy for whether an incentive is sufficient. I think if you strip down the process of a cost-based rate setting, it is intended to be a little more precise and quantitative than to simply administratively set a rate and see who comes to the party, if you will. I think the idea is to understand within the market what the total capital expenditure requirements are, operating requirements, expected production, expected financing. All of these things feed the model, and this, well, in an adjustable block program as opposed to a declining block program, you should interpret, all of my comments as leading towards an appropriately set cost-based rate that may adjust up or down over time. So I think it's really a means of hopefully getting the price right, if you will, or as close as right as you can, so that you can fulfill your quantitative deployment goals at a reasonable cost to ratepayers. I guess I should say, in the programs that we have been involved in firsthand that do collect data from market participants, they're either kept confidential or aggregated and anonymized. So we're certainly not recommending anything that would create any kind of competitive or impairment. It's meant to it's meant to be an enhancement to the program and ultimately to the market overall. There's a question about whether when new rec prices go into effect for the 23-24 program year, and ideally we would.
I think Anthony is he can unmute himself now, I believe. So Anthony, are you able to?
Yes. So can you read the full question?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Anthony. It says new reg prices go into effect in the 2023-24 delivery starting June 1st, 2023, right?
That is correct. So again, this is Anthony Starr. I apologize for the audio problems I had at the beginning of the webinar. I am the Illinois Power Agency's Interim Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for participating. But the focus today is the bigger picture, long-term plans we have in terms of how are we stepping back and looking at what approaches we're using to rec pricing for the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program, and that this is a process that will lead up to whatever proposals we will include in our next long-term plan update, which will be released for public comment in August. Parallel to this, we also have a process in place where we've released proposed rec prices for the 2023-2024 program year and a separate stakeholder feedback process for that. So that is happening in parallel with this bigger, longer term process. And that updating process is a more narrow process, basically focused on updating inputs into the model that we've used up to this date on setting rec prices for the two programs.
Thanks, Anthony. That's great. And I have a follow-up, which is appropriate for you as well. And this question is there a deadline for when the methodology must be decided upon? So you just referenced the draft long-term plan in August, I believe. So maybe you could elaborate on that. This question seems to ask about that, picking up from that process.
Sure. So I think there are two separate considerations. For the 2023-2024 year, we are not updating the methodology. We're merely updating inputs. What we are then doing, and this is something we had committed in the long-term plan that was approved last year, was this independent review of rec pricing methodology that we're really grateful to have Sustainable Energy Advantage conducting for us. We will then use their research, their input from stakeholders through this process and the written process to propose in our new plan a new methodology. That will go out again in a draft format in August. We'll take stakeholder feedback. Then I believe it is in October, we will file that plan for Commerce Commission approval. There'll be a regulatory proceeding before the Commerce Commission from roughly October through February, at which point the Commerce Commission will issue their final order. So there's multiple steps along the way in which we'll continue to debate whatever methodology we settle on, the strengths and weaknesses. People could provide objections or improvements, suggestions to it, but that ultimately would be all determined by February of 2024 when the Commerce Commission approves the next long-term plan. So that would then give us several months to take whatever the output is of that approval process to implement that methodology in order to have new REC prices that would go into effect June 1st of 2024. I suppose part of the question is, there will be certain, if the methodology changes significantly, that could have significant impact on REC prices in any direction. How will that all play out? I think as the approval of the plan plays out from the period of October through February, we're likely to be publishing a set of prices based upon the methodology that's proposed, and then refining that. So there will be sort of interim, lots of better word, bites of the apple on this. But certainly until the Commerce Commission approves our next plan, they could make decisions in their approval that go in any number of directions. And so we really won't be able to finalize things until after February of next year.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'll take this as an opportunity to say again that Sustainable Energy Advantage's culminating deliverable is a report which will give us the opportunity to explain and explore some of these topics in a little more detail. And so to further that process, we look forward to and will use all of the feedback that we receive through your written comments to address your questions specifically, to elaborate in areas, to explain, to provide enough information and explanation and examples to help inform, help support an informed decision-making process. That is our goal. So I suppose bringing it back to today's session, if there are questions related to the presentation where maybe you'd like to hear, you have some clarifying questions, or are looking for examples, or just simply looking to see one of the slides again, you can feel free to ask that now. In the alternative, what we will do is move to the Inflation Reduction Act related analysis, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about that or anything during our second Q&A period.
Jason, it does look like there's one person who has their hand raised, and I guess it looks like a Madeline Klein. I just want to make sure that Madeline had the ability to ask her question.
Excellent. Yes, please. Let's see.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes,
Yeah, we hear
great.
you.
Please go ahead.
Thanks for taking my question. So as you know by now, the net metering statute in Illinois is very, very complicated and sort of obtuse, and the CEJA Act created some further complexities than the utility tariffs that implement net metering for both Ameren and ComEd are also somewhat complex. And there was a lot of discussion in the ICC docket around the long-term renewable resources plan last year about, are the large DG customer assumptions about, what about net metering and the value of credits and what components are getting credited, are those accurate in there's a lot of discussion about that in the record, and the ICC ended up basically punting it to you. They didn't know it at the time, but that's what they were doing. And so, I just want to make sure that when you attack the model, and particularly for the large DG customers, you don't, sort of simply start with existing assumptions about net crediting or the value of net metering credits, and then project forward based on whatever your assumptions are, but you actually unpack the assumptions that went into the last round of valuation of those net metering credits for large customers, so that we can make sure that we're getting it right going forward.
Yeah, Madeline, thank you. I agree both that they are complex, apply differently to different customer classes and therefore incentives, and that it needs to be unpacked. Yes, so we will endeavor to do that, and also communicate with the consultant for the annual REC incentive calculation process to make sure that we are being supportive of one another while respecting each other's scopes. But we do agree that there, while it is complicated and will take a material amount of work, that there is an answer to this question, right? I mean, the tariffs are being fulfilled now, so we would tend to agree that it needs to be unpacked and clarified in the context of this conversation. So I recognize my answer is qualitative for now, but I think we are seeing this similarly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I don't think I've missed any other raised hands for now. Please know we can you can return to questions of any kind after this next presentation. So Jim, I think if it works for you, I will make you the presenter. So you should be able to share your screen and walk us through the IRA discussion.
Had multiple, there we go. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and I guess everyone just feel free to pile in the chat if you can't hear me for whatever reason. So yeah, so my name's Jim Kennerly. I also am with Sustainable Energy Advantage. So another part of our scope is to determine what aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act might require certain changes to the basis for, the cost basis for pricing the RECs in the Illinois Solar for All and the Adjustable Block Program, Illinois Shine. So I'm going to just dive right in. So I'll just say, and I guess I'll just go through this really quickly, which is to say, so I'm just going to talk really briefly about the methodology we used for considering sort of what we consider to be, relatively speaking, consensus changes as a result of the IRA, and then kind of talk about policy changes nearer to the end. So the first section is about sort of the methodology we used for considering various impacts of the IRA, and then our recommendations for what the sort of quote unquote consensus changes would be for the ABP, and then also for the Solar for All program. And then at the end, I'll kind of just walk through some policy questions that we felt as if it was, there was not necessarily likely to be as much consensus, or sort of reflected policy decisions that may or may not need to be made in the wake of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, and also I've included as an appendix what we had in the original presentation, which is a summary of the provisions that were related to DG in the Inflation Reduction Act. Obviously, there were some that related to energy storage that are outside the scope of this program. So we really focused on the aspects that related to solar PV and the investment tax credit and other sub 5 megawatt changes. So in some ways, the presentation is sort of assuming a relative baseline of understanding of what those Inflation Reduction Act changes are. If there are questions as we go along, happy to answer them, but I just wanted to note that we will we largely have sort of moved that to an appendix just to sort of focus on the changes we're suggesting. So how did we think about the changes that we're suggesting as a result of the IRA's enactment? So I think we came from a place of thinking that, for various cost-based programs to be effective, they need to reflect, typical projects, the cost, performance, and financing conditions for typical projects observed in the market to date. And so when we're thinking about changes to the IRA as a result of the IRA, our changes are intended to represent what we thought were typical projects in each market segment or class in each of these programs. So, but not only that, when there's a market that's undergoing significant change, there's also some scope for the program administrator, to not just look at typical projects, but also to signal to the market which kinds of projects of those that can be feasibly developed that they want to have, play a larger role in the project as time goes on, in the program as time goes on. So in essence, we're basically looking at changes that reflect, projects that are already typical to Illinois, but also in what we're really kind of assuming in proposing these various changes is, what we thought to be typical projects in the Illinois market. And so for that, we took, a closer look at, how the various blocks have cleared in the last year, and essentially the various Solar for All projects as well that have been approved in the last few years, just to understand in general what sort of a typical project or a set of typical projects look like. So in terms of the ABP, so the first category, of course, we looked at was small DG. So our view was that for small DG projects, a 30% investment credit, an increase in the investment credit to 30% made sense for both host-owned and third-party owned systems. So even though these projects have a different tax credit, so the residential credits tend to be for, at least for host-owned residential systems, tend to be the 25D credit for individuals versus the 48 or 48E credits claimed by business taxpayers. So in both cases, the IRA made that investment credit 30% for the 2024 to 2025 program period. So we would suggest moving that to 30%. We would assume also that the IRA's provisions related to prevailing wage for installation labor, we wouldn't recommend any incremental impact, given that CEJA already requires prevailing wage for a number of different types of projects, which would include small DG. And so, and not to mention the IRA only applies to projects greater than one. The prevailing wage provisions in the IRA apply to projects greater than 1 megawatt. And also, in our experience thus far, we have not seen any clear evidence that the apprenticeship requirements actually increase project costs. So we are unclear that makes a difference at this juncture. However, if you disagree or you have some experience to the contrary, we would definitely like to hear about that. Another provision of the IRA that was significant for DG is the ability to count transmission and distribution. I think it was referred to as just interconnection property in the basis of the project for calculating the investment tax credit or the successor clean energy investment credit. So it wasn't clear to us what the impact for the typical project was. And this was because for projects that are less than or equal to 25 kW, those are usually not cost causers in a distribution group study. And so as a result, we didn't really think it was likely that it would apply here. However, if the owner is likely to get the 48 or the 48E credit, we do think it is likely that, it is at least possible that this interconnection cost amount could be, included in the ITC basis, if in fact that were to happen. However, of course, with interconnection, smaller systems tend to have smaller fees. So in the end, we thought it wasn't particularly clear what the impact would be, but at the same time, if it's a business taxpayer, that's the type of project it would apply to. So therefore, a third-party owned project, such a change would apply to it. So in terms of the provisions that are referred to as direct pay, so direct pay, of course, is the ability to take your credit as a cash payment instead of as a tax credit. We wouldn't recommend assuming that the typical project in the small DG space would be eligible for direct pay, of course, because it is not likely, the typical project's not likely to be owned by a tax-exempt, nonprofit, governmental, or tribal entity. And also, the IRA created what's called a transferability regime that essentially allows for the transfer of a tax credit to from one taxpayer to another for a fee. At this point, though, there are no rules associated with this, and so we're not recommending making any change until those rules are better known. So moving on to the large DG and traditional community solar, we felt like the recommendations for this were more or less the same across the two categories. So we combined them into two. But so for this, of course, we would assume that the investment credit should be 30%, whether it's for the existing ITC or for the successor clean energy investment credit, which comes into effect in early 2025. Again, no effect from the prevailing wage provisions for the same reasons as for small DG. And interconnection, we would assume in this case that this be specifically accounted for these kinds of projects. And that's because these projects are rather uniformly going to claim the Section 48 or 48E credit as a business taxpayer, or, well, I guess in this case, as a business taxpayer. We have there is some potential uncertainty regarding direct pay for nonprofit or government-owned projects, and so we'll get into those later. But these are pretty, in our experience, pretty typically squarely a project that's going to be owned by a business taxpayer. So again, yeah, we're not assuming direct pay eligibility for much the same reason. This is a business taxpayer and thus unlikely to be eligible for direct pay, or is not eligible, I should say, for direct pay. And same provisions regarding transferability, just not recommending that at this time just because of the lack of rules. For community-driven community solar, assuming again the same 30% investment credit, same lack of incremental impact for prevailing wage, and would again recommend that interconnection costs be counted in the ITC or clean energy investment credit basis. We would assume direct pay eligibility, and this is an interesting case because it wasn't clear to us whether from these projects, whether the typical project was a tax exempt entity or was a business taxpayer. So if it is a tax exempt entity, if the typical project is owned by a tax exempt entity, we would recommend that you assume direct pay eligibility. So for direct pay, of course, the requirements are that the project meet minimum domestic content requirements. And so if direct pay is assumed, we also recommend that minimum domestic content requirements be assumed as well. And again, no specific impact regarding the transferability regime. And of course, that would need to apply only if the owner was a taxable entity such as a business taxpayer. So moving to the public schools segment, we again would assume that such a project, we would recommend assuming such a project would get a 30% ITC or CEIC. However, if it is owned by the public school, again, the domestic sourcing would need to be included. The cost of domestic sourcing would likely need to be included in calculating that rec price. And if minimum requirements were met, it also could be eligible for a 40% tax credit, given that domestic sourcing has a bonus value of 10 percentage points. Pretty much the same answer as for all the other categories regarding prevailing wage. CJA already requires this, and also would suggest assuming interconnection costs in the basis, including in the case of nonprofit or government-owned facilities, because, and this is interesting, because we're assuming that they would be taking the credit that a business taxpayer is eligible for just in cash. So if they're acting in such a way, you know, we're assuming, and if folks disagree or have a different interpretation, I think we're very open to hearing differently. But if you're taking that tax credit via elective payment or direct pay, we sort of assume that the IRS would likely view you as such a taxpayer, and so you'd be able to take that credit as well. If others have a different interpretation, happy to hear it. So we would assume, of course, that the project would be eligible for direct pay, but only if the project is assumed owned by that tax exempt entity. And again, not assuming impact from the transferability regime until we have rules and it's clear what the offers are associated with such projects from tax equity investors. So that's the basis of that's the set of recommendations we have for the adjustable block program. Just want to dive in real quick and talk about the Solar for All program categories. So the first one, of course, would be low income DG for 1 to 4 unit buildings. Would assume the same 30% tax credit, whether it's host owned, customer owned, or third party owned, and also if it was owned by a nonprofit or government entity. So again, prevailing wage, we would assume that the IRA would have some impact, assuming that the project that was serving such buildings would be, larger than 1 megawatt. If it was exempted previously by CJA, it would now be subject to that recommendation on the IRA. Again, of course, not clear at this time if the apprenticeship requirements increase project costs. So if folks have thoughts about that, happy to hear it. So for interconnection costs in the ITC or CEIC basis, basically we would assume that, yes, these kinds of projects would be able to claim the interconnection costs in the basis, except for projects that are host owned for less than 10 kW, because those would get the 25D credit for individuals, to which that allowance does not apply. So for direct pay, we would not assume that in this instance. We took a look at this sector, and it did appear that the typical project was not owned by a tax exempt entity. If we misread the data there, very happy to adjust this recommendation. But as far as I could tell, it did appear in most instances to be a project owned by a business taxpayer. And then transferability, again, unclear, because they're eligible in theory, but no rules. So for 5+ unit buildings, pretty much the same assumptions as for 4, and then pretty much the same direct pay and transferability assumptions as for 4 as well. For nonprofit and public facilities, so this is where it starts to get interesting, for direct pay. So we would, if this is a project that is owned by nonprofit or public facility versus a third party owned, business owned project, we would assume that it would get the 30% credit via direct pay, but again, it would need to assume the incremental cost of complying with domestic sourcing requirements. And of course, such a project would be eligible for a 10 percentage point bonus assumption for that domestic sourcing. The IRA would also, prevailing wage would apply except for projects that serve houses of worship that are at or below 100 kW. And so obviously if this is the project in question, that kind of project would not be able to benefit. However, unclear to us that is the typical project. So we would aim to suggest what is the case for the typical project. For interconnection, it's not clear. I mean, and this is what we were saying before, it does look like if the project is eligible for direct pay that it would be treated as a business taxpayer in effect and therefore be able to claim the interconnection cost as being part of the ITC basis. But again, this probably needs some greater interpretation, and happy to take comments on that issue. For direct pay, of course, this would only be for tax exempt government tribal owned projects, and those projects that are owned by a private entity, though, should be assumed to benefit from the Section 48 ITC or Section 48E ITC, or sorry, CEIC, without those domestic sourcing requirements, and so therefore you wouldn't assume the incremental cost, but also would not assume the bonus either. And again, no impact from transferability because the rules, or the lack of rules, excuse me. For low-income community solar project initiative, so we again went to the list of awarded projects for this. It did appear that all projects would be able to claim 30% credit. It did appear that these projects tended to be third-party owned, but even if they weren't, it is possible to claim the 30% credit regardless. Largely the same provisions as for nonprofit and public-owned facilities for prevailing wage apply. So in essence, the IRA isn't doing much here, but CEJA does have some exclusions. The interconnection costs, again, yeah, we would assume everything could claim the transmission and distribution property in the basis, except for host-owned projects under 10 kW. And no assumed direct pay eligibility for low-income community solar, and again, unclear impact of transferability. So, having said all of that, we did also get to some questions that we felt were a little less than clear. I think some of the direct pay issues, as you can tell, were a little bit unclear, even sort of from the consensus section that we had. So most of these questions have to do with bonus credits and how to account for those bonus credits in developing REC prices. So the first sort of set of questions, I'm just going to read it from the screen. I know that's a no-no, but I wanted to make sure I got all of the nuance here. So should the IPA establish REC adders for IRA bonus credit eligible projects that may or may not align with certain public policy priorities if claiming such credits costs more than not claiming the credit? So I think what we're trying to say here is, for instance, does it make sense for projects that qualify for the energy communities bonus credit, that are, say, on a brownfield and require some added remediation costs? Should the IPA provide adders that might go beyond that might be somewhat higher cost than, a project that was not eligible for a bonus credit, because the state should give more revenue or sort of give a signal to the market that this is a desired project category. And I think the same largely applies for the domestic content requirements in the case that it is not associated with direct pay, and also in the cases that the projects are eligible for direct pay. Of course, in the case of direct pay, you have to meet those requirements, and so that's that would be required. But the question really is, should the state and should IPA be setting rec prices that are rewarding projects for domestic sourcing? So some other questions would be that, what about in the case where bonus credits lower prices? So should any of the projects that have lower prices now, as a result of these bonus credits, have lower compensation? I think there are a number of examples here, but the real question is there a benefit to ratepayers of having lower compensation, assuming these bonus credit values? Obviously, some of these bonus credit values, such as for low income, is much more based on a sort of application and award based process, so may not be as simple for the adjustable block program as it is for the Solar for All program. But more or less, should the benefit of those credits flow through to ratepayers in the design of the 2024-25 plan? There are also a number of different direct pay policy questions. I'm not going to go through all of these just because I want to make sure we make time for everybody's questions, but just understanding really how to apply direct pay here, because there are a lot of considerations, particularly with regard to incremental cost, particularly with regard to who can claim it and how. And I think understanding how that will work will be critical for understanding a number of the cost provisions and cost and for the cost analysis associated, particularly with a number of the Solar for All categories. So I think I'm going to just stop there and see if there are any questions. Let me just go through here. Let's see.
Yeah, Jim, the first one for you is, can you say more about why you are assuming no impact for prevailing wage requirements for projects larger than 1 megawatt?
I think I'd have to know exactly who is asking that question, because I can just unmute them and ask them to tell me which slide to go back to. Does it say?
It's Madeline Klein.
Madeline. Okay, let me just see if I can unmute Madeline. Having trouble. Yeah, Madeline, are you able to unmute yourself and ask?
Oh, yeah, I just unmuted myself. Thanks. Yeah, so maybe I was zoning out or something, but if you could just say a little bit more about your assumptions that the new prevailing wage requirements for projects over 1 megawatt, your assumptions that will have no impact.
Well, no, not that there was no requirement for prevailing wage, but that simply the IRA didn't appear, I should say, to add further requirements beyond state law. It could be that I misunderstood state law, but as I read the prevailing wage provisions of the act, it did appear that get some feedback in the background here. There we go. Yeah, I think I was just trying to say that it didn't appear that the IRA had any specific incremental impact relative to state law, if that makes sense. Okay, let me chew on that. Thank you. If we're correct about that, we certainly would like to know so we can get that in the final report. So.
Okay. I'll chew on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Were there others, Jason? I couldn't quite see. And of course, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I'm happy to unmute and chat with anyone.
I think I want to ask Anthony if he had anything he wanted to add to that topic.
No, I think Jason, I think you got it covered, that we would already be taking into account prevailing wage as a requirement in the adjustable block program for projects that are over 1 megawatts. The exemptions there would be for, again, residential projects, houses of worship under 100 kW. So there's no additional consideration around the IRA prevailing wage requirements that we think that I think my understanding would that we'd have to consider.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a follow-up question that reads, is prevailing wage required for all ABP projects built after September 21, regardless of federal safe harbor status under the IRA? So it sounds to me like that's what you're addressing, Anthony.
That's correct. There are exemptions for prevailing wage in the adjustable block program, but they would not apply to projects over 1 megawatt. So in fact, there would be quite a few adjustable block program projects that are subject to prevailing wage requirements because of state law, but that would not be subject to them because of the IRA. So projects, that are 100, 200, 300 kW in size.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm not, unless I missed a written question, Jason, it looks like no one else has their hand raised.
We do have one more written question on a different subject, and
Okay.
it is, are you assuming the production tax credit and the investment tax credit are roughly equivalent? There are probably a couple ways to go about this, but Jim, you go ahead first.
Yeah, I mean, so I do a fair amount of modeling of, DG projects and tax credits and things of that nature. And as far as I know, the PTC, as far as I can tell, the PTC only really has substantially more value than the ITC if the project is in the, sort of 20, 50, 100 megawatt range, because everything below that, the NPV impact of the ITC is much more substantial. And so, if that is the net impact, our assumption is that, folks trying to maximize the value of their projects are going to be electing the ITC, and thus we'd recommend the ITC. But that said, I think if that were somehow to change, likely would have to change, via a really significant change in costs or a really significant change in the law, which I don't foresee in the near future. I wouldn't say they have an equal value. Would you agree with that, Jason?
I mean, yeah, picking up right where you left off, Jim, I think I have the same opinion, and all I can do is, state it in different words. I would say, no, we don't assume that. Yeah, we do not assume that they are roughly equivalent. What we know is that it is a math problem, and that you should do the math. But generally speaking, I agree with Jim that unless you are in a economies of scale, or for some other reason, lesser installed cost position, that one would expect the ITC to be more valuable on a present value basis, as Jim said. But it does allow for projects that, for whatever reason, have if you imagine that XY plot of production versus capital cost, you, with the production tax credit as an option, you can arrive at a place where it is more valuable. But we don't make the blanket assumption that they're equivalent.
Yeah. Yep.
Jim, not seeing additional written questions at the moment.
All right. Well,
nor do I see hands raised. while while our participants are pondering whether they have additional questions to ask now, I just want to make a quick observation that I did not necessarily underscore perhaps enough in my comments, even though it was clearly designated on the slide, where an idea for discussion is suggested for all projects versus projects over 25 kilowatts. So just calling your attention to that that distinction, and appreciate your written comments being inclusive of whether your comments are intended to apply to all projects, to projects less than 25 kW, or to projects greater than 25 kW.
Yeah, same with the IRA changes. Agreed. So, okay, I think that was it for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are right at the conclusion of our prepared remarks, and so Anthony, happy to take your other comments or any last questions from stakeholders, or in the absence of that, we would say thank you very much for your time and your participation today.
Yeah, hi, it's Anthony again. I know we covered a lot of material. As was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these two presentations, as well as a number of questions, are available on the IPA website under, if you go to renewable resources, it's under, I think, stakeholder feedback, I believe is what we've titled the page. And so you can download all the materials that you saw today. And we do really want people's feedback to help Sustainable Energy Advantage put together the report they're developing for us on their recommendations for how we should think about future methodologies for renewable energy credits. So we covered a lot of material. I know that it probably takes a little while time to process, but it might be good just to hold things open for a minute or two in case there are any other follow-up questions people may or may not have.
Yep, happy to hang out for a minute.
Certainly, and again, this session has been recorded, and we will post it in the event that is helpful to you or to your colleagues.
I take it from the plunging attendee numbers that we may not have that many additional questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We look forward to your written comments and the remainder of the process. Thanks again for attending today. Bye-bye.